We are going to go ahead and get started with our last breakout of the day. Here in the growers session, we're going to have this whole hour and a half dedicated to sustainable practices. This was one of the most popular answers on the surveys you all filled out. You wanted to learn more about this, and there are so many different practices here. We want this to be interactive, so you're going to hear from two of our experts, Carrie Klebanowski from the Looney Farm and Kevin Marshall from Indigo Acres, and they'll tell you this too, but we want this to be interactive. I've got several people monitoring Zoom chats, so shout out your questions. We'll get to them when we can. If you're on the app, we're monitoring that question and answer session as well. So let's make this a great learning session about sustainability.
I'm going to use this mic because I have to move. I don't stand still well. That's why I'm a farmer. My name is Carrie Klebanowski. Like Mary Ruth said, I'm from the Looney Farm. We are a very small, we're a half-acre base vegetable operation down just a little north of Ellick, Oklahoma. I learned how to say that about 2 months before I moved down there in 2015 from Edmond. I like to say that I'm a reformed suburbanite. Who saw the error of those ways and got into agriculture a little later than I probably should have in life, according to my back and most of my muscles, but we love it down there. We initially started it as a homestead and just wanted to get healthier and have more control over our own food sources, and then in about 2017 recognized that market gardening was a profitable business operation, and that there was a lack for access to good, local, high-quality foods, and wanted to be a part of that. So we started the Looney Farm vegetable operation at that point. Actually, 2018 was our first growing season, and so we're going into our fourth year. It's grown by leaps and bounds. It was just me and my husband helping on the side when we first started, and now I have a crew of two amazing full-time women that work with me on the farm every day, Monday through Friday. And we are actually here at the Farmers Public Market every Saturday year-round. We're also at Scissortail Farmers Market April through October. And this year, thanks to COVID, we also launched our online storefront. So like most people, we had to find a different avenue. So I'm here today with Kevin, and we're going to talk about sustainable agriculture processes and practices. And I want to start by saying that we understand that just the term sustainable in itself carries a wide variety of connotations and meanings and definitions to anybody. It's a buzzword, just like no-till and organic is. But I think that it's an important thing because I think sustainable, with all of its different meanings, is the goal of any business, right? Is to be sustainable, to keep being able to have a business next year and the year after and the year after, is to keep growing. And as a grower, I want to be able to continue growing, but I also want to have sustainable practices that help protect and preserve and enrich the resources that we're using, our soil, our water, and all of those things that we do. So the different contexts are gonna vary depending on your scale. What I'm doing on half an acre is not gonna be feasible for somebody probably on 400 acres or even 10 acres possibly. But I still think there's a lot of really good information that we can all take from each other's. Something somebody's doing on 10 acres may not directly be something I can do, but I can probably glean something. So when Kevin and I tell you we want to be interactive, what we're really saying is we're going to be interactive. If that means I have to ask you a question directly, I'm not afraid to do that because I want to learn. Like I said, this is our fourth year. Kevin's 2 or 3 years ahead of me.
This is our sixth season.
Sixth season. So he's 2 years ahead of me in growing. I guarantee you I don't know everything I need to know about sustainable growing in Oklahoma. And Kevin doesn't either, and he will tell you that. But I definitely think that there's a lot that we can all glean from each other, and so please don't hesitate to ask questions, interrupt us. We've tried to break this up into giving us plenty of time, and so if you don't ask questions, we're just going to make it awkward and ask you questions ourselves. So we are not here to tell you everything or how to do something, but again, we're here to facilitate the discussions so that we can all learn how to be better growers. So with that said, we will talk about 4 main subsects of sustainable agriculture practices: soil health and management, crop rotation, cover crops, and then some other growing methods. Let me scroll this down a little bit. I have to keep myself on task, you guys, by reading. Yeah. Next slide. Okay. So I have up here some resources, and one of the big things with soil management and soil health, and I think Kevin agrees, as a grower of vegetables or even producer of animal products, the soil that we're growing in or that we're feeding from is what determines the quality and the end result of what we're getting. And if we don't take care of that soil and manage that resource, then that's going to be directly reflected in what we're presenting to our customers. And I know there's been a lot of talk in the news lately about, the topsoil is gone from a mass quantity of growing land in the United States. We're not immune here in Oklahoma. We all know. We don't get half-inch rains here. We get 4 inches in 2 hours. The wind. We have a really awesome clay level about 18 inches down, and where I am, I have a lot of sand on top of that. I also farm on a pretty decent slope. I think I have a 2% grade, which putting a tunnel on that was a really fun experience. But there's a lot of aspects that go into that soil erosion. So my goal as a farmer is to do everything I can to feed that soil and grow that microbiology within that soil so that I can have the healthiest plants possible, the most nutritious, the most flavorful. And that starts with knowing what I have to work with. How many of you guys are growers here in the room? Okay, everybody, good. So are anybody here do cattle or anything like that? I was kind of curious. Okay, very cool. How many of you do soil tests regularly? Okay, good. That's where we started, and I'm the first to admit I get a soil test and look at it and go, oh, that's nice. What does this mean? But I think that's where we have to start, is by testing our soil on a regular basis. Probably more frequently here in Oklahoma than some places, again, because of that heavy rains. I can have amazing soil on my soil test, and then 2 months later that looked completely different because we've had 8 inches of rain. And everything that was in my soil is now gone or washed away, or I have no topsoil left. So things like getting soil tests, I've listed several things. I pulled up the websites, and hopefully there's a link for you, but if you can write them down or take a picture. Your local extension office is a great place to start for those of you who are not testing yet online, or if you're just getting started, go there. We actually use Logan Labs. In terms of soil testing, there's a spectrum of that as well. We started with the basic soil test, and that tells my NPK, that tells me what's available in my soil, what my soil has. But we took it a step forward and did a saturated paste test. So they wet the soil down with some distilled water and show you what's available to your plants in that soil, what the water can actually draw up into your plants. This year, because of some input we've received from some other growers nationwide, we're going to start doing some plant sap analysis. To take it even one more step further, for some of our crops that are high-dollar crops, we want to be able to see, okay, not just what do I have, not just what's available to the plants, but what are those plants actually taking up into themselves? And so that will help me know what I need to do. We're not organic, we're certified naturally grown, which means we use organic items. And that's not cheap. Those amendments in the soil, the compost is not a cheap thing. And I want to make sure that I'm doing that in a way and adding those things to my soil in a way that's actually benefiting and that the plants are actually getting. So I highly recommend you looking into Logan Labs for that. Midwest Laboratories is another one that does those as well. Micah, do you know, does the extension offer plant sap analysis? Does the extension office testing, do they offer plant sap analysis? Do you know on plants? For testing? Okay, I don't think so yet either. So that's just something, if you're interested in knowing what your plants are actually getting, I would recommend looking into that. I also list here Ellen Polishuk for consulting, and she's just a name that I was referred to. She was an organic farm manager in several different places all over the United States for over 30 years, and now does consulting. And it's reasonable. You can have your test sent to Logan Labs or Midwest or whatever and have her have her get the results, and she'll spend 15 minutes to an hour going over those results with you and giving you some input from her experience on what maybe would be a good idea for you to add to your soils. Beneficial nematodes. This is something that has been kind of more and more brought up in some of the circles that Kevin and I take part in the small gardening community, farming community, market gardening, is adding those beneficial nematodes to your soil on a regular basis has drastically reduced pest pressure. Things like flea beetles, all kinds of, aphids, all of those things, just on a monthly basis from starting in March through when it starts to get cooling down, maybe October, I think, just once a month, adding those to your soil, depending on the scale you're growing at. Again, that's going to be a different cost for about an acre of land. It's going to be less than, I think, $80 a month, which to get rid of flea beetles is amazing. That's one thing that we're adding in this year. In addition, we do, as an organic farm, we don't use any chemical products. We do spray with some of the biopesticides, but the goal is to not be doing that, and to have that soil life and the microbiology inside that soil protect my plants, have the plants be strong enough, and that they can fight those pests off. So we're adding that in. A second aspect of soil testing or soil management that we wanted to talk about a lot is that soil composition, not just the microorganisms and the nutrients available, but the actual composition of your soil. As I mentioned, we have a lot of clay, typically in Oklahoma. I think we hit, depending on our farm, certain areas we have 12 inches down, we hit clay, and other areas maybe 18 inches. When we were putting in our high tunnel last year, we had the guy using the auger on a bobcat, and he blew the hydraulic line trying to drill a post, just going through the clay. And so what happens is, with that composition, and I'll show you this picture here, is with tilling, you can end up getting a hard pan layer. I'm not going to sit here and tell you never till. We are a no-till farm, no-till, low-till, I really say. For our farm, with our style of management, we do an initial breaking of the ground, but because of the high quantity of Bermuda grass that was grown and sown by myself when I had animals, we don't want to encourage that rhizome growth. So we do an initial till, and then everything we do after that is just adding to the soil or as little soil disturbance as possible. Kevin will go into this a little bit more, but really the goal is to be able to create, as you can see on that right-hand side, that network of biospores for the nutrients and the water to go down instead of running off. I'm sure you guys, if you've grown for any length of time here, you've seen crusting on the soil with the winds we get. That can be something we struggle with as well. So we're adding a lot of organic material on top. We don't till it in. On our farm, we use a tiller, but we use a depth roller, so we're not going more than about 2 inches deep just to mix in the amendments. But that can even be done without the use of a tiller. It can use a harrow. What's the digger, the strippers that on the larger scale behind a tractor can do the same thing. We want to open that. We use the broad fork on our farm quite a bit, and I'll show you a picture here of that in a few minutes. Just to add in some more of those pores for the water to be able to get down to those nutrients that we're adding in to help feed the microorganisms within the soil without creating that hard pan. Kevin will also talk a little bit more about what we do. We have about 50%, or a little more than 50% of our farm currently under cover right now. So we have one high tunnel and 4 caterpillar tunnels, and then that's covering the ground. And if we're not doing that, we're using landscape fabric on pretty much anything that's not under the cover, just to be able to help protect our soil and the growth of those microorganisms from the wind and from the heavy rains and washing out because of the slope we have. Sorry, I can't. So again, all tilling is not bad. Most grounds will need some, and there's definitely cases when it's beneficial to do a till on soil if you have, my magnesium levels are pretty high, and sometimes they said adding a slight till into an area will help release some of that potassium in your soil that the magnesium can tie up. my high tunnel is a new ground. We had to do a lot of dirt moving to get it level enough to plant into or to actually get the high tunnel on. And so I can't even, getting the stakes into the ground for the row cover required a hammer, and that was just ridiculous to me. So we are tilling in some things, some peat and some other additives to help with the soil. Roller crimpers can be used instead of tilling, if you're on a larger scale for seeding things. We've even added in on our seed sowers the blades that actually cut instead of just pushing the soil. So we can do a no-till. I can leave residue from the previous crop in the ground and sow directly into that's broke when it started breaking down, and not have to worry about that getting pushed around or letting those microorganisms break it down. And I know Kevin agrees with the soil. We believe the soil really can heal itself. We just have to work within our business constraints, because I got to have crops to grow, to sell, to be able to be in business, but also balancing that with my ideals and what my goals are to build up the soil as well. And the scale will take its toll on that as well. Okay, so this is some pictures of one of our beds. This is one of the ways we're getting away from tilling, and one of the ways with our garden, we do intensive succession planting. So it's not uncommon for me to be flipping a bed every 4 to 6 weeks. And really, 4 weeks is probably more accurate. With that's taking a lot from the soil. I realize that, especially in the summertime, growing lettuces in Oklahoma, to keep those lettuces sweet and happy and not angry and bolting, I got to feed them a lot. And I want to take care of the microorganisms and keep them happy as well. So the picture on the left, you can see that's a picture of some of our lettuce beds. It was a direct sow lettuce mix that we grew. And what we've done there is we've taken and applied compost to that. We will water that in really, really, really well. We'll add any amendments that we need, depending on what crop is coming next. Will vary on the amount and the type of amendments we add. But then we'll cover that. And in the middle picture, you see we use a reusable woven fabric, landscape fabric, to cover it. And the picture on the right is that same bed about 10 days later. And that, of course, is going to be faster in July and August. Doesn't work so well over the winter when you don't have as much daylight because of the Persephone period, when we're under 10 hours and the temps are colder outside. If we have sunlight, though, unlike this winter, you guys, if you've been inside of a cat tunnel or a high tunnel, it can be 20 degrees outside and 90 inside that tunnel. So if we have sunlight, it can still work fairly well. But we love this because we know that the reason that soil, those things are breaking down, is because we know we have really great earthworm activity and microorganism activity in that soil. My employees and I, the best thing is when you're rolling that fabric up and you can just see all those little tiny granules from the earthworms that they've left deposited on the top of your soil bed. I will add, though, too, it's worth mentioning again that some of those beds that we have, because of the soil composition, because of that heavy clay, and depending on how long we've been doing this, we do still have to go in and do some broad forking sometimes, or even just kind of using a stirrup hoe to kind of stir things in so we can get our fingers in and do those transplants. And then this is just a picture right here of some of the implements. I mentioned the broad fork. If you haven't seen those, there's actually a local welder in Oklahoma City, Edmond area, Mayfield Metalworks, and Kevin actually has one of his broad forks. I'm waiting for mine from him. I think he just finished a bunch more, and so I'm going to be getting one of those in the next week or so. But even just a cheap one I got free when I bought my BCS. It's a really great full body workout. One of my employees does CrossFit, and she really gets after it with the thing. She throws it in the ground. I don't. I want to be able to walk afterwards. But it does a great job of putting those holes in the ground, lifting up the soil without rotating it over, so you don't end up getting the hard pan layer underneath. We'll typically put the compost down. Use the broad fork, put the compost down, add any fertility and amendments that we want, and then take a light rake or even just the power harrow and kind of stir it in and kind of smooth things over for sowing. The picture on the right is actually just an under view and a top view of the flail mower. And this is what we'll use. The lettuce bed that you saw had been just harvested. We use a quick cut harvester for a lot of our greens. So we cut it down pretty close, within about an inch maybe, if we can get it in time to the soil bed. If we aren't doing that, or if it's a crop that we don't harvest by hand or harvest with a quick cutter, we will take the flail mower through, and it's basically a lawnmower. If you have a lawnmower on a small scale, you can use that. I've actually used a weed eater as well. It's a little messier with the weed eater. You end up wearing a bunch of it, but the flail mower just chops it into very small particles on the bed and leaves it like a green mulch. So accomplishes the same thing as we had in the other bed, but just has that. I know Kevin will talk more about using the flail mower here in a minute with cover crops. And then you can also refer back to I left Mayfield's information on Facebook as well in the group. Okay, crop rotation. So this was the scariest thing to me as a farmer getting started, was crop rotation. And I'll be honest, it's still a big daunting thing for me. I get the concept. What I'm struggling with as a small micro grower who does rapid successions and intensive plantings is figuring that out and fitting that into my scale. Because I look at this cycle. This is one from J.M. Fartier, who's a big mentor of mine and Kevin's, and it makes sense. But I'm transplanting every 4 days, and I can't rotate plots. Most of the charts you see will show rotating from, greens and roots to brassicas from one season to the next, and that's great if you're growing big blocks. But I'm growing single beds of individual things. So what I'll show you next is this is kind of blended. Sorry. This is just a screenshot of a graph that we created at our farm, and off to the left would be dates. Basically, each of those, the 6, 7, 8, 9, those are beds in one of my tunnels, and off to the left would be each block going down from top to bottom is a different week of the year. Okay.
Okay, Carrie, sorry about that.
No, you're good.
Someone online is asking, question about the broad fork. I tend to use a garden fork. Do they ever do that instead? And how would the broad fork compare to the garden fork? They're guessing that the broad fork is just a bit deeper, but they're wondering.
I'm thinking like a pitchfork. Is that what they mean? Like a garden fork? Because if that's the case, I've used a pitchfork, yeah. The broad fork is just like, our broad fork is not quite 30 inches wide, I guess. And I think the tines are 14.
They're saying no, a 4-tine garden fork is what they're talking about.
Probably, if it looks like that, only smaller with shallower tines, then yes. And what's interesting with the broad fork is on my heavy clay areas, and I tell this to my employees all the time, the goal is not to get it down as far as possible. The goal is just to kind of help loosen the soil. So there's beds of mine that I just opened up last year that I may only get 3 inches down on that 14-inch spike, but I'll just put it in closer together. I typically go about 1 foot to 18 inches apart when I'm breaking open the soil. I just will do that closer together because I don't want to flip over that clay, those big chunks of clay, and that's, if anybody's tried to direct sow into clay chunks that are dry with a Jang seeder or any kind of precision seeder, it's a nightmare. So I hope that answers our question. I think so, probably. I don't think it would be a problem to use. It's just going to be more labor to do that. Anyway, so this is one of our, just a very small glimpse of how we manage crop rotation. We create a big crop plan of all the different successions, basically on a big spreadsheet of all the different successions of all the different crops we're growing. And some of those are weekly, some of those are bi-weekly, some of those are one time a year. And then I go through with my group, and our goal is to, as I put in here, instead of single rotations per season, we rotate through crops multiple times on a single bed. The goal is not to have the same crop in a bed twice. So if I have lettuce or Salanova like you see here in bed 6, after that, my goal is not to put Salanova or head lettuces in there again. Really, my goal is not to put a green in there again. My goal is to put something root bound or a different kind of, a whole different group, maybe a brassica, to be able to do and feed that soil different root exudates and to be able to break over that soil a little differently. It's not easy, and on half an acre, it's a struggle to get more than about 3 or 4 months at a time. The reality is, sometimes I just plant something where I have space available, and that is not ideal. But again, there's other things we do in terms of how we're using the nutrients that we're adding to the soil, what amendments we're adding, and how we're caring for those, with the beneficial nematodes, what else we're doing to the soil, the compost, those things to be able to feed that soil and help negate any downside to planting lettuces or something twice in a row. Okay, this book, you guys. So I've actually seen several pictures of this book. I've seen this book around for a while. I mentioned that I have 2 employees now. I actually had an amazing employee this past summer who applied. He was supposed to work for an entire year. He was the youngest ever master gardener in the state of Texas at 15, and he had just finished his freshman year in the organic ag program at Cornell University and wanted some field experience. And I would have been stupid to say no. So I said, yes, please come to my farm. And he has been great, even though he's back at school now and abandoned us. He frequently sends me emails, and one of the emails he sent was basically PDFs of all his college textbooks. So I did not say no to that. And this book, Crop Rotation in Organic Farms, again, it's kind of a staple. What I started skimming through it a few weeks ago, even before I knew I was going to talk about this, just for my own personal benefit. But as I started planning for this, there was a lot of good things that I gleaned from it, and I wanted to talk to you guys about briefly before Kevin gets into the details of his sections. But this book can be used in lots of different ways. It can be used as a simple reference, just to kind of look through and get some ideas. For example, you can check for different pest or soil problems, and it can give you some suggestions on different cropping sequences you might try to remedy that. Or it can help you determine how long to leave a field out of a particular crop to avoid a particular pest problem, if you've seen that in the past. There's several other things, like there's 12 experts that they mention throughout the book, and they show about their discoveries, about their crop rotations. It gives their examples that they've used, but then it also walks you through being able to plan your own systemic plan for crop rotations on your own farm. Some of the best things that gave me the most sense of calm after the dread of, oh my gosh, how am I going to not screw up my farm by not doing all these crop rotations, was reading some of their inputs on, as farmers, there's so many different things we have to think of. In the earlier session today, this is a business. I grow things, but this is a business. First and foremost, I have to have stuff to sell, but I have to be able to sell it, right? So I wear many different hats. I'm also, thanks to the freeze, I'm becoming really good at plumbing and repairing broken and frozen pipes. I'm pretty good at irrigation things now. Like, there's a whole different host of hats we wear. But I appreciated this, and this is just going to be a real quick thing. I'm not going to read through all of these, but they talk about, in considering crop rotations and all that goes into it, there's a lot of different factors as a farmer we have to take into consideration. And the first thing they talk about is look at the different tasks you have to do on a farm, and that will help shape how crop rotation works into your farm plan. And they list out the 10 most things. And the number one thing is we have to maintain the crops. I think crop planning and soil health is huge in that. But there's so many other things. This is on a weekly basis, most of us are doing this. I know on a daily basis I'm walking through. Several times a week I'm probably planting. I'm preparing soil as soon as weather permits, which one day in Oklahoma you can permit it, and the next day, it all can wash away. I know our plan is we're trying like crazy to get beds prepped right now to get brassicas in the ground so we can get them watered in really well without having to use any extra water later this week. So that's what my crew is working on at home today. You have to do your rotation plans. You have to monitor those conditions, which again can change on the drop of a dime or a hat. And you have to adjust your actions according to field and crop conditions. So that plan I have is great until Oklahoma. Because I literally, after the freeze we had, I had seedlings that were still alive in the ground, and they looked really good considering they'd been through 10 days of freeze and negative temps. But according to my crop plan, I had plants that needed to go in the ground from the nursery that if I didn't get those in the ground, I was going to back up everything else on my plan. So I ripped out the babies. And that's something that you have to figure. So your crop rotations are going to change based on those different kinds of factors. And then you have the 10 most difficult tasks. And this is where you get into the real brains part of it, where you lay in bed at night thinking about all the things that you dealt with all day long. There's all kinds of different things, and I'm not going to get into these. I want Kevin to have lots of time for his cover crop section. But just assessing the profitability, investigating new market opportunities, and like they talked about in the morning session today if you're there, like figuring out where you're going to market your plants. So many factors that go in, and tweaking your crop mix. I grew the plants that you saw, that lettuce mix that was a direct sow. I thought it was going to be great. It looked really great. My customers hated it. So guess what? I'm not growing anymore. It was a lot easier than transplanting and a lot cheaper seed, but my customers weren't buying it. So now I have to change everything because that was how I was going to grow all summer, and then I had to shift. So lots of those different factors that you have to consider in addition to your rotations. And then real quickly, the goals for crop rotation. And there's a lot of these, so I would hesitate to try to read every single one. I think most of us know most of these. They make sense. But I think it's good for us to remind ourselves of some of these. We want to maintain that biotic diversity, number 12. Number 14, it reduces labor costs. The less I have to do to my soil, the better. The less I have to do work-wise to break that soil open, to work those plants into the ground, the better. It leaves time and energy for me to market my plants and do other things. Reduces weed pressure, number 4. Reduces Bermuda grass, it's not on there, but it should be. And I think for us, number 2, produce nutritious food. I mean, that's the goal, is we want to have the healthiest, most nutrient-dense produce we can for our customers. It tastes better, it's better for their bodies, it's better for the soil. It puts back into the soil better quality food for those microorganisms and to continue that cycle from going. So that's all I had really. It's a really broad thing, and I know that crop rotation, does anybody here do a systemic crop rotation that works well for them on a small scale? Any questions on that? Yes, ma'am. She asks, how much compost do I put down per crop flipping? So, I have 100-foot beds, and I don't do it all year round. I don't add a lot of compost in the wintertime just because the soil biology is not as active. Starting about this time per year, depending on the crop, my lettuces and things like that, I'm so bad at like 12 5-gallon buckets worth per 100-foot bed. That's my mathematical calculation. A lot. We had last year 4 deliveries of 15 cubic yards of compost for the season. And I probably could have used a little bit more. Some of that I do heavier, like I have beds in my second plot that I add more to because it's only been open, I've only been growing on it for 1 season. And I mean, when I got my soil tests, it was not great. It was 2% organic matter versus 4% organic matter in my plot that I've been growing 2 years on. So, which is still really good for Oklahoma, by the way, I've been told. But I have goals, so better. So, yeah, we're very compost heavy, both of us, I think. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna let Kevin talk, and then I'm gonna ask you guys questions more too.
I'm Kevin Marshall with Indigo Acres. We are out of Edmond, Oklahoma, and we are starting our 6th season as a small market garden farm. Prior to starting Indigo Acres, I was a computer nerd. I spent 30 years as an IT consultant, working various jobs, and after 30 years, I just got tired and quit my job. Kind of not the smartest thing, and then me and my wife had a big house in the city, and we sold it and bought a small acreage out in the country. And didn't have enough money to retire, and I kind of looked at my wife and said, what am I going to do now? She said, well, you've always gardened. You've gardened for 30 years. Why don't you start a farm? And I said, are you smoking crack? Nobody in her right mind would just start a farm without a plan or an idea. But I started to garden. I started growing because we're on a little acreage, 2.5 acreage. And my little garden got a little bit bigger and got a little bit bigger, and then all of a sudden, I kept saying, what am I going to do? She said, you need to start a farm. And again, I thought she was smoking crack. She finally talked me into it as a small market gardener. I went to the Edmond Farmers Market. Somehow they accepted me. I don't know how. But within the first 5 minutes of the market opening, I was hooked. Once somebody came and valued our vegetables, I knew I had to do this the rest of my life. So we started Indigo Acres, and it was a big struggle at first, because as a backyard gardener, I made all my own compost. Of course, our backyard garden is about the size of the stage and raised beds, maybe a little bit bigger. It's not hard to make enough compost for that, but when we're on 2.5 acres and I started a compost pile, it looked kind of silly out on this acreage. So we began studying how to deal with stuff, and a friend gave me a book called The Market Gardener Book by Jean-Martin Fortier, and he talked about purchasing compost, stop trying to make it. I'm like, okay, I'll go do that. Started buying compost, and then we did that for a couple of years. And then the medical marijuana business came along, and the price of compost, in case you all have been following it, well, it's a little bit high like the smokers of the marijuana. About our second year, I think I spent something like $4,000 purchasing compost. And I'm like, this has to change. That's not sustainable. I can't make a profit spending that, especially if I want to grow and grow. So I wanted to start cover cropping. And so I started downloading stuff. I said, hey, there's got to be a book out there on how to do cover crops for a small market garden. Well, I got real frustrated because all the information I had on cover cropping has to do with large acreages and sustainable practices on 400 acres, which doesn't apply to my half-acre market garden. Books are downloaded and says, well, yeah, you need to put so many pounds per acre. And I'm like, well, I have a 250-foot square bed. How many pounds of seed do I put down for that? So I really struggled, and honestly, I failed miserably. And I want to share that because I'm sure a lot of you have tried to do cover crops on your small farms, your small acreages, and there's so many problems that it's just a continued challenge to try to, when do you grow that and when do you put your crop in? Because if your crop's in, how can you grow a cover crop? If you're growing a cover crop, how can you put a crop in? And I really struggled with that on a small farm. So it's taken me several years to come up with a strategy, and I hope to share how we do cover cropping at Indigo Acres. And we're not where I want to be yet, but you'll see here in a little bit that we've come a long ways, and I have a plan to get where I want to be. And I think that's important, that it doesn't matter where you are on this journey, to start somewhere. So today I'm going to talk mostly about cover cropping. I'll also talk a little bit about other growing methods and how that is sustainable to your soil. In particular, we'll be talking about protected culture. So what is a cover crop? I like putting that out there. I think everybody here knows what that is. The definition's up on the screen. It's a crop that you plant in the ground. It helps your soil. That's the short answer. But I like to give the example to friends of mine that ask me about cover cropping. I like to say, well, a dandelion is a cover crop. It's a plant. It actually helps your soil. In fact, if you have a lot of dandelions, you probably have poor soil because a dandelion doesn't grow good in a well-fertile soil. It has this deep taproot that goes way down deep, grabs nitrogen, which we all as farmers want, pulls it up to the leaves, puts it in the leaves, and the leaves die down, breaks down into organic matter, and puts nitrogen back into your soil that your other crops can't get. So a dandelion is a cover crop. Here in Oklahoma, we're all pretty good at cover cropping, aren't we? Because I think most people have that. So for farming, that may not be the most applicable cover crop that you want to do. So I think everybody here probably knows the benefits of cover cropping. I'm going to have to put my glasses on because I can't see without them. Soil health, and that's what we're talking about today. Soil health is why you do cover cropping. Particularly, it increases organic matter. Carrie talked about her soil samples at 2% to 4%. And that's pretty much the range where we're at in Indigo Acres. We did soil samples years ago, and when we started, everything was at about 2%. In different parts of our land, we test, and things have developed differently, and I'll explain that. But the most important thing I found about organic matter is water retention. When we first started Indigo Acres, I wanted to be the kind of guy that really conserved water. So I thought, hey, I can get some rain barrels and put gutters on my house and put over on the barn and save all this water and water my farm with these rain barrels. And I started doing the math of how much water I needed to water a farm. And it was something like, 2 million, 3 million gallons of water a year. And I'm like, I don't have a rain barrel that big. But I started reading on soil health, and I learned that every 1% that you can increase your organic matter per acre, it will store 60,000 gallons of water. I'm like, I don't need rain barrels. I got this acreage. I just need to increase my organic matter. So cover cropping is very good at that, besides improving the health. It also is good at disease management, increases fertility. Weed suppression. You'll see here in the next slide an example of how a cover crop does weed suppression. Companion planting for pest management. You can use living mulches, and it also brings in great pollinators. So let's go to the next slide. And this isn't our very first time that I felt like I successfully did a cover crop. And this is a picture, one of my favorite pictures. It's wasn't our first garden plot that we started, but it's the second, or actually it's the third, but it's the first plot that we did cover cropping in. And we did cover cropping for an entire 1 year. It was land that initially wasn't usable. We had to level it with a tractor. And at that point, it had clay and stuff that was turned up, and it was just horrible looking dirt. So we started cover cropping. I put in this case, this is crimson clover. We followed it with a summer of Sudan grass. We did some buckwheat. And we came back in the winter with crimson clover. And then we tested the soil after that 1 year. And this is right next to our very first plot that started out at 2% organic matter, and this one started at 2% organic matter. The first plot, we added compost every year. We did about 1.5 inches of compost over every bed for 3 years. The other plot with just compost in 3 years went from 2% to 3.8. I kind of patted myself on the back thinking, hey, I did that. In 1 year, with zero compost, I went from 2% to 4.2. And from a cost perspective, this plot, I may have spent about $300 in seeds. For the first plot, I spent about $3,000 to $4,000 of compost. So there's a cost benefit to your cover cropping. It actually does save you money. The challenge is, during that 1 year, I was not growing any crops, so there is a cost to that also. This next picture is the same field about 4 weeks later. Crimson clover is so much fun because when it blooms, the bees and honeybees comes in. It just creates a great pollinator area. One of our neighbors is a beekeeper. He thanks me every year because I'm feeding his bees. But if we back up, there's no weeds here. There used to be weeds there, but this suffocates stuff. All the weeds germinate, but they get choked out by the clover or other type of stuff. And so we actually, as one of our best areas of the farm, because the weeds that we have is very minimal because we've choked out the weeds as we've done this plot. This next slide is not a picture of Indigo Acres. I probably don't have a strong enough back to dig that good of a hole and get down in it and take a picture. But I wanted to give you a visualization. We think of our cover crops of what we see, what grows above the ground, all this green stuff that we cut and we turn back into the soil. In this example, this is probably a ryegrass or a barley or some sort of annual type grass. 50% of what is grown is underground already. The root mass goes down, can penetrate, and depending on the particular type of cover crop, will penetrate that subpan that Carrie talked about. It's caused by no-till. Can break that subpan out, break it up, and then as it dies, creates these water channels. She had a slide in there about the micropores where the water can go down to the deeper parts of the soil. So your cover crops are multi-purpose. Besides creating this organic matter, it's actually creating structure. The roots are also most important because they're bringing in fungus, mycorrhizin, and all of this microbial life that feeds the soil, which then feeds the worms, which feeds our plants, which feeds our bellies. So it's a great way to grow the health of your soil. So how do you manage a cover crop? Throw in some seeds, cut it down. Well, that's the short answer. How do you manage a cover crop on a small micro farm? How do you manage it on a large farm? Two different type answers. And how do you do it in a backyard garden? That's, pretty easy. So to plant it, there's a couple of different methods. One is broadcasting the seed. I've used different methods to broadcasting. I've used basically hand broadcaster that you buy down at Lowe's, Home Depot. I still use that on a smaller type plot. Also use the push broadcaster. You can also buy a broadcaster to go on the back of your PTO if you're a bit larger. Put the seed in and broadcast it out. This is the simplest way. Spread the seeds, water it good, the grass will grow, or the seeds will grow. The downside is if you're just broadcasting it and leaving the seed on top of the soil, about half of it will not germinate. So if you do that method, you have to double up on your seed cost. To get around that, you can create a seed bed and use a harrow or maybe a small tiller, mix that in, or a rake if you're doing it on a small scale, and it'll increase your germination by probably going from 50% up to about 85%. You get a thicker mass. So to consider that as you're doing it. Machine method. Larger farms use what's called a drill, and I'll be honest, when I started reading about a drill, I kind of thought they were talking about what you buy at Lowe's, and you take a drill and you drill a hole in it, put the seed in. I'm like, that's crazy. No, a drill goes on the back of a tractor. You don't get an IT guy to understand that. So eventually I learned that a drill is a device that hooks onto a tractor on a PTO and drills the seed down. The advantage of that is you can actually plant it into an existing cover crop or plant residue and don't have to do prepared seed beds. So that becomes very popular. Obviously the cost is different, the scale is different. We use a lot of Jane cedar in our planting of our crops, whether it's beets or carrots or other direct seeded stuff. So I thought I'd try it. You know what? Works great. Here are 3 beds that I did last fall. Put in crimson clover. I used a Jane cedar, made 4 passes on each bed, watered it in good, and voila, I've got a beautiful stand of crimson clover in these beds. I also wanted to put this picture in here to show you how resilient crimson clover is for a winter cover crop. This picture was taken Sunday. I don't know about you, but I had a little bit of cold weather in the last month. You might be able to look closely, you'll see a little bit of frost burn on top of it, but this being the coldest winter, this was a great cover crop to use, very resilient, took a beating this winter. It has already just bounced right back up within a couple of days of the ice and snow melting. This was already back and growing again, so very, very versatile particular thing. So what do you do once you grow your cover crop? If you do nothing, you're going to have the crop go to seed and it'll reseed itself. And if you're not going to ever grow there again, that might not be a bad thing. It's self-seeding, sustainable, continues to do that. But we actually want to put a crop in there and do something with it. So somehow you need to terminate it. And that's the words they use if you look it up. And the big farm books say terminate it by putting herbicides on it, such as Roundup. We don't recommend that. It can be used to terminate the crop, but you actually lose a lot of the biological life when you put that chemical in the soil. We prefer mowing it. Carrie had a picture of a flail mower that attaches to her BCS. We also have a BCS and a flail mower, and it basically is a different type of mower that it mulches it to chews it down like a wood chipper, so it creates it very small and it's easier to break down. Doesn't have to be a BCS with a flail mower. Before I had my BCS, I got out there with my push mower from Sears Roebuck and mowed my cover crops. I don't like doing that because it was hard on my back. And we have a question coming in.
Yes, we had a quick question from online from Kelda. I wonder if that number for half as much germination with just broadcasting on top. She's wondering where you saw it. I wonder if whoever collected that data also compared to broadcasting seed, then straw, then leaf mulch thrown on top.
That's a great question. That number is just an example. I've tried some different things over the years to kind of see what works for us. And it's not a scientific number, but when I do broadcast into maybe where I've got grasses growing and it's not a prepared seed bed, and then going back, I can see that I didn't get germination. When I've had a prepared bed, I get it much better. I have experimented with broadcasting it into an existing cover crop that's growing to get the seed down there, and then cut the cover crop to lay that on top, and that actually improved it. I couldn't give her a number, whether it's 75% or 80% or 90%, but by putting the seed down and just covering it with a mulch, I did improve my germination significantly. I'll use that word, but I don't have a real number. So as I go through a season, I'm doing a crop after crop, we do cover it up because it is hard to come back and do a full prepared seed bed. Great question, thank you for that. So the flow mower works great. The second item on there, weed eaters work too, probably better for a small garden, but in my second year I did do some buckwheat and I didn't have the flow mower, and I got in there with my weed eater and, well, it worked. 3 hours later, I decided that probably wasn't cost effective. It probably wouldn't work on some cover crops that are thicker like a rye or an oats or barley, but buckwheat is a very soft type plant if you haven't grown it, so it worked on buckwheat. Crimping method is not something I use. It's used a lot on the larger scale farms, and it's a device usually hooked to a tractor that comes along and rolls and bends the plant, breaking the stem at the ground level, creating a nice flat mulch on the ground. So crimping is something that's done. Winter freeze obviously is not going to work on some crops because some crops are grown for the winter. Buckwheat is an example. I like to plant it in the late summer and fall because it'll grow up, and I do go ahead and towards middle of September put my crimson clover across the buckwheat while the buckwheat is growing, and I'll leave it alone. The buckwheat freezes, falls down, and the clover has already come up. So I actually am growing both at the same time and have been able to do that. So some crops you can plant in the fall, radishes or different things, you get a winter kill, and then they'll go ahead and begin biodegrading over the winter and creating mulch for the winter. Chemical use, again, is very effective. Not something we recommend. I think most of us here are really working to get on our soil health, but we absolutely don't recommend it. How am I on time? That's great. What to do after you terminate the cover crop. So we've killed our thing by mowing or weed eating or letting it grow, but at some point we want to get that back into the soil because that's what we're trying to do, is improve the soil health. So how do you do that? Number one, you can do nothing. Basically, the mulch itself is helping the soil because it protects it from rain, protects it from erosion, so just your grass or whatever crop it is that's laying on top of your soil, doing nothing helps your soil. Isn't that easy? So the mulch itself is great. Some people do till or plow it in. The plowing turns the soil, the tilling does it slightly different. Those are methods to get it into the soil. You saw a picture a minute ago of our raised beds. We do raised beds and we use a BCS of the rotary plow. So what we do is use the rotary plow to go along our pathways to kick dirt on top of our mulch to cover it up. And then Carrie showed a great example of what she does to turn her beds with her crops. We do the same thing. We cover it with the soil, sometimes a little bit more compost if we need it, water it, and then we cover it with either a tarp or just landscape fabric for about 10 days, pull it off, plant right into it. There's a little bit of plant residue at times, but at that point, it's broken down enough that we're getting some really nice soil. So that's what's working for us.
Hey, Kevin, one more question. How did you determine your crops to be successful?
My cover crops? Mm-hmm. How do I determine? Well, if they grow. Sorry? Oh, what type do I grow?
She said, how did you determine your crops, ? And then to be successful. So I'm not sure which way you want to take that.
That might be a slide in a slide or two, but it's probably a great question because what I determine, you have to determine what you want to do, what you need to do, because my needs are going to be different than everybody's here. And I'll tell you what, if you wait just a minute, I think we'll probably answer that question. And if I don't, please have that person follow up with me. So we till our soil, or we do the raised beds. We also have a plot that we're never going to grow on, but we actually grow cover crops there, and we rake it up. We have a rake on a tractor, and we use that to make compost, because we still use compost because we don't get to cover crop everywhere. You can also take that mulch, take it into your high tunnels and use mulch in areas where you're not being able to do that, so you can actually use your cover crops grown in one location, move it to another, and put it into the soil. You can also plant directly into the mulch that's on the ground. We talked about the drill earlier. That's what a lot of the large farms do, is they'll lay the mulch down, come back with the drill, put in corn or wheat or whatever they're growing, or another cover crop. In the case of us, covering it with a landscape fabric, and if I'm transplanting, say, tomatoes or something into it, that's possible. We don't do that for our direct seeding because it clogs up our seeder. It just it doesn't drop the seed correctly. So, what to plant and when? So that, I think we're getting into the section that might answer the question, what have I decided to plant? And honestly, early on, this is where I failed miserably because, I'd get a book and I'd read on it things, oh, that sounds so exciting, I'm going to grow alfalfa. And then I'm like, how do I grow alfalfa? I don't know how to grow alfalfa. And do I need alfalfa? Well, it adds nitrogen. Well, I think I need nitrogen, but do I? Carrie talked a lot about soil samples. So to determine what to grow, you need to know what you need. There might be different reasons that you do a cover crop. Sometimes our soil is fertile or we have good organic fertilizers that's adding the fertility, but we have a lot of clay and we don't have good drainage. So those might determine that more importantly. So what you need to think about in determining what you want to plant is your goal fertility. The example of fertility, if you want to add nitrogen, alfalfa, any of the peas or legumes, beans, clovers, those all add nitrogen. Those are nitrogen fixers. Phosphorus, buckwheat is a good scavenger of phosphorus, makes it available back to the crops. Many of the cover crops actually are good for the phosphorus. The potassium is one of the harder ones. A lot of the green manure crops will help, along with tubers. And the red chicory, I've never grown chicory as a cover crop. It wasn't a mix once. But your soil may be compacted. You've been driving a tractor over it or something, you have very hard, thick soil. If you want to break up that soil, I recommend sunflower. Sunflower has a multiple purpose. The roots are very big and thick, can grow down very deep, and at the end, and then they're real pretty. They bring in the pollinators, which is great. You can actually do tours of your farm, and people go nuts when you have a big field of sunflowers. So that can help promote your business. But when you cut it down, it creates a nice mulch to cover the top, and the roots stay in the ground, create these channels where it's opened up. A lot of the other tuber type stuff is good for the compaction, such as turnips or radishes. Organic matter is something that is my goal. So to answer her question, I've decided to do a lot of the stuff that adds more organic matter because that's what's important to me at Indigo Acres, is to add more organic matter. So with that, some of the grasses, the clover is a dual purpose that adds nitrogen and it creates a large biomass of stuff. For organic matter, my absolute favorite is sorghum Sudan. It's a little scary because it looks like Johnson grass, so when you're growing it, you're like, what have I done? But it's not Johnson grass. It doesn't go to seed as fast. But it grows up between 4 to 6 feet tall. You can cut it, and it grows back up another 4 to 6 feet tall, and again, puts roots down up to 6 to 8 feet deep, adding organic matter deep in the soil. And that was one of the things that we do in our summer program, which you'll see in a minute. Weed suppression, buckwheat is really good in the summer because it germinates fast and grows fast and creates a canopy. Many of the other grasses do the same. You have to be careful when you're doing a cover crop just for weed suppression because they can go to seed and then they can become the weed. They say buckwheat is one of those. I've never had a problem with buckwheat coming up anywhere. It's just a beautiful plant. You can also do disease prevention and resolution. If you have a disease plot, we highly recommend any of the brassicas, in particular mustard. They have different chemical components in it that help fight the disease and restore the health of the soil. So those are the reasons you would pick a particular crop. The next thing you need to know is when are you going to plant that? You can't plant buckwheat in the winter because it's one of the freezing plants. So here's an example of some of my favorite, this is not an all-inclusive, these are my favorite seasonal type stuff. And I actually have on my calendar, I use a Gmail calendar because it has nice reminders and it's free. I have an annual reminder to plant. And I got kind of excited this morning because it popped up this morning and said, hey, it's time to plant your oats and peas. And I'm like, yeah, I got that done Sunday. Check. That was done, so I was pretty happy. But for the spring, I start with an oats and peas mix. The peas add nitrogen, so that gets things started early in the season. The oats grow up, creating organic matter along with the roots that go down, very deep roots. It also gives a trellis for the peas to climb up. That gets turned back into mulch. We can also do barley in the early spring. We do some mustards, or ryegrass is very popular. Once we cut those and we get into the warmer season, we'll do either buckwheat, sunflower, the sorghum Sudan that I've talked about a moment. And if you're still worried about nitrogen, cowpeas is a great summer crop. It will grow in 125 degrees in the desert. It's crazy. The cowpeas, you can actually then harvest the cowpeas, sell them at your market, turn them in, and you've added nitrogen to your soil at the same time. So that's a cash crop opportunity. As the summer goes on and we go into the fall, winter, fall planting, we might do some radishes. I almost always do a clover rye mix. Wheat is something that's very good, and I've never done fetch, but it's a very good nitrogen fixer. I just like the clover because it adds more organic matter than the fetch does.
One more question. So how do the Sudan grass roots compare with Johnson grass roots? It's not so much Johnson self-seeding as much as eliminating those roots?
Yes, so the Sudan grass roots are roots like oats or barley. It's fibrous and goes down. Where the Johnson grass is a rhizome that goes across, and if you till Johnson grass, that 6-inch rhizome becomes 6 new plants. So it doesn't propagate. It's not as evasive as the Johnson grass. The Johnson grass also does the seed head very fast, and that seed head then gets spread all across the world. So if you don't have Johnson grass, you're going to get it pretty soon. It's horrible. So the Sudan grass, you'll see when it starts to go into seed head, that's when we cut it before it goes to seed. And I have had some go to seed, and it just doesn't seem to be very invasive. So that's why I like it. I mean, besides it's doing a great thing for my stuff, it's manageable. You do need a pretty good mower to cut 4 foot to 6 foot tall grasses. So our flail mower is actually strains a little bit when I let it get to 6 feet. So about 4 feet, I start trying to cut it. I've seen it get higher. If you had a tractor-based PTO, you might be able to get away with it 6 foot. All right, that is our seasonal guide. Now how are we on time? Got 20 minutes. That's wonderful. Plenty of time for questions, too, coming up. All right, so we talked a little bit about why we grow cover crops. I think we already know that. We talked about what type of crops to grow, and we've also talked about when to grow them. So that's easy. Anybody can kind of get all that information. But how do you incorporate that into that small business when you've got your stuff growing, you got your crops, you got everything else? And that's where I failed miserably, and I think a lot of people struggled with that. So the strategy I came up with that is now working for Indigo Acres is much better. I'm not quite where I want to be. We're all on a journey, but I've got a strategy to get there. So what's important is that you guys think, what strategy are you going to do, and just start doing it. You'll probably feel like I did, and you'll adjust it and come up. So I'll talk a little bit about my strategy that's working for us, and it may not work for you for all the reasons that it works for us. Indigo Acres is a small farm. Our total property is 2.5 acres. Our farm site is about 1.5 acres. And we're probably only using 3/4 of an acre that's in production. Doesn't sound like a lot, but I found that this system that we're using produces a lot of crops. So I don't think I'll ever need to be able to grow my entire 1.5 acres to get the revenue that I'm wanting to do. I did my taxes last week, and I guess we made too much money, so it's working. If somebody wants to help with my taxes, you can, but where I'm getting at is I don't need 10 acres to make a profit. I made a pretty good profit last year on 3/4 of an acre. I am expanding. I do want to get bigger. We all do. We'd like to make more money. So how does that work for us? How do I get a cover crop where I'm growing food? Well, because I haven't used all my land yet, that picture we showed earlier of the cover crop, cover crop earlier, I knew I wanted to do that a year out. So my strategy was, I want to expand into that area next year. So I do a 1-year program on every new plot. The other plots I haven't gone back and redone yet, but on a new plot I have a program that we begin as soon as we can begin working the land. We just did a plot on Sunday, actually started working, leveled the ground on Friday, Saturday I took the day off, and Sunday I got my peas and oats planted. So it's a plot about 100 feet by 45. It's going to bring me about 10 raised beds in that plot. So right now we got the peas and oats, in particular the peas, because I want to add nitrogen right now. As soon as I cut that and turn all that back in, I'm coming in with a sorghum Sudan grass, which is going to be great big thick biomass to add lots of components. There's actually some weed suppression chemicals in the Sudan grass also. But it does need nitrogen. You're going to have good soil to go cover crops. So I'm starting with nitrogen, then I'll follow up with something that's going to take that nitrogen and add a whole lot of organic matter back. When that's done, I'll do a late summer buckwheat, because it's good with the phosphorus, and it also adds a nice tilthing to the top of the soil. It's a nice soft plant that breaks down fast. And then we'll come in again with a winter crop mix of rye and clover to put the nitrogen back in that we've already taken from it, and then the plot will be ready in the next season. So that's what we do with new plots. What do we do with existing plots? Very difficult. We try to do crop rotation, and I'm failing miserably there, but we put in a bed and it'll come out, and we try to put in another crop and it comes out. But there are times that we find that we have about a 3 to 6 week period that, hey, I pulled out that crop and it's hot and I can't put in a bed right now, or I don't have plants ready to go in. So anytime I've got a 3 week window, I put in buckwheat. Germinates in 4 or 5 days, and even in 2 to 3 weeks, it gets up to about 6 to 8 inches that will then process that back in. And we have a question.
Yes. So how many types of cover crops do you plant together, or are they all one type at a time?
Wonderful question. I've done both, where I've done one crop at a time. Ultimately, the best thing you can do for the soil is a large mix. A good friend of mine that's here today told me at one point he'd talked to a scientist that said it's best to do 13 crops. As he talked about it, it's all about the roots that adds different nutrients. They're all working together. One does one type of fungus, one does a different type of fungus. So there are a lot of mixes out there that you can buy, a summer mix or a spring mix or a winter mix. So the more times you can mix your crops in, the better. And we've beginning to try to do some mixes, but I usually try to do 2 to 3 crops. With the Sudan, I don't, because it's so big it chokes everything out. But when I'm doing other stuff, I've done a mix of mustards and brassicas and kale and okra and sunflowers for a summer mix. And we're actually experimenting this year with a pollinator mix in areas adjacent to our beds, just because it's going to be pretty and bring in the pollinators, which I think will help our land too. So the more you can mix in, the better overall health you're going to do. So yes, when we have an empty bed, we'll put in a buckwheat, even if it's just grown for 2 weeks, preferably 6 weeks. We'll get it turned in, we'll mow it down with our flail mower, we'll water it, we'll cover it, pull it back out, and we'll put in our new crops. At the end of the season, and this is where I failed earlier, I always thought, hey, I'll put down a winter cover crop at the end of the season, and then we'll turn it in the spring. But that doesn't work too well because, one, the crop doesn't really mature until March or April or May, and we're trying to plant in February and March. So it's hard to plant into certain things, but I do take a percentage of our beds, because I don't plant everything in February and March. I plant about a third of it, and then about a third of it, and then we continue to plant. So I take about a third of our beds and go ahead and do a cover crop. When something comes out in September, we'll put down our clover or rye or whatever we're doing, grow that for a winter. That picture you saw earlier, the 4 beds of the clover, that was planted last September. Right next to it, our bed's covered with the tarp. We'll be planting in those probably tomorrow morning. Weather holds, it looks good. And then here in a couple more weeks, we'll start flipping those 4 beds that have the cover crop. So we're trying to rotate in when we can. Now, our total long-term strategy is eventually I'll have 6 or 7 plots, a plot being anywhere from 10 beds to 20 beds. Our plots are different sizes. Every 6 year, I'm going to take a plot that's production and let it go fallow, meaning I'm not going to put any crops in there because I got that bed ready last year, This bed, I'm going to now remove all of my crops and go back to my program of a 1-year cover crop. So I'm doing a cover crop rotation every 6 to 7 years. So every plot will get a full cycle of a 1-year cover crop. There's actually some biblical aspects about letting your fields go fallow every 7 years, which is kind of why I'm following. That's why I picked that number of 7 years. But also gives me opportunity for the soil to heal. I've taken from it. I abuse my soil, only in the sense that I'm growing a whole lot of vegetables to sell to the market. So I've got to give back to my soil by doing that. So we will be rotating our plots out, and that's the strategy that's working for Indigo Acres. I'm benefited or blessed with the fact that I'm able to have enough plots to do that rotation. Something I also had thought about prior to that is maybe just taking part of a plot out for a year. So if you can't take out an entire plot, take out a third of a plot or 20% of a plot, and then next year 20%, and rotate just a few beds and do cover crops. There may be a couple of the ways you can modify that plan. How am I on time? I got 12 minutes. I'm already going to go through this next part real quick because we want to leave time for questions and comments and discussions, and it includes for stuff that Carrie's commented on. So the other areas Carrie and I talked about is how does protected culture, what does that do for sustainability? In particular, what I'm talking about is high tunnels or caterpillar tunnels or hoop houses. Just by having them in nature is sustainable. You wouldn't think it because we put this plastic out there what you think is bad for the earth. But you cover part of your ground. Carrie talked about earlier about how in Oklahoma you either don't get any rain, which is bad for our soil, or you get 6 inches in a week. I know in 2018, I wish I only had 6 inches in a week. I don't know where you were, but we had 26 inches in 2 weeks. The area that I had a high tunnel, my soil was great. It didn't get beat down. It was soft and flush, and I kept growing. It was wonderful. So by reducing the elements, your protected culture automatically helps your soil. In the winter or the off seasons, your soil is warmer, keeps the microbial life going, earthworm activity. So there's just natural things happening when you use high tunnels. Also, you don't get crusting. Crusting happens when you get even just a light rainfall that breaks that top 1/8 inch and then dries and crusts back over. Then you get another rainfall and it runs off because it can't penetrate down. So your high tunnels naturally don't get natural crusting. It can be difficult to do cover cropping. I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of money and time and effort building my high tunnel. I feel, and we grow 4 seasons, I feel guilty when I've removed a crop from my high tunnel and I don't have something back in there in 30 minutes. I feel like I'm wasting my resources because my high tunnel is my money maker. It's a high rent district. So I don't feel like I'm able to do a cover crop, but I still have to take care of that soil because I'm abusing it. You can do companion cropping. Put in particular type plants that bring in the pollinators so you can still get other stuff in. And basically, you can also grow other types of crops as a mulch. Tomatoes might be an example that you can put in something down below them because we've pruned them up high. You just want to make sure that you have good airflow. So that's something to consider on that. And that's kind of what this slide is saying. Make sure you're not competing for nutrients. If you have a shallow crop in your high tunnel or shallow rooted crop, your cover crops can actually suffocate and wipe out your crop, so you don't want to be counterproductive while we're here. So you want to make sure what you're planting works with the type of crop. You don't want to have competition, but probably you can actually introduce disease, which is counterintuitive of why we're doing cover cropping. High tunnels tend to be more humid. Higher humidity is where the disease is. So if you've created too thick of a cover crop under your plants and you don't have that good airflow, you might actually be introducing disease. Consider putting vertical fans in your high tunnels to keep the airflow moving on the slow summer days. So the portable hoop houses also become, the name caterpillar tunnels becoming popular through a company called Farmer's Friend. We utilize caterpillar tunnels on some of our plots. They are portable. I wouldn't say they're just real portable. It's not like you can just hook your tractor up and drag it over to the other plot. You have to disassemble it, move it, and reassemble it. You can disassemble these in probably about 2 hours, reassemble it in about 6 hours, assuming you have no wind and you get the plastic back on. So I talked earlier about we have different plots. Right now, 2 of our plots are completely covered in caterpillar tunnels. They were completely cover cropped, so they're good for now, but when it's their time, I will take those caterpillar tunnels down, move them to another plot, and go back and do a full-fledged cover crop. So if you're using the caterpillar or portable tunnels, take advantage of the fact that they're mobile, moving them, going back, doing your cover crops for a season, then you can move your tunnels back in. All right, that ends the official session, and I want to open it up for questions, not just for me, but for Carrie. Try to stump the experts, because one, we're not experts, but try to stump us, and if you've stumped us, then that means you're doing something right by your thinking. So give us your ideas. Tell us what's working for you on cover cropping. Tell us what's not working. Please share your stories, because you can help us quite a bit too.
And also that can pertain to sustainability in terms of farm business. As we mentioned that all of this ties into we have to be able to sell our crops. That's the goal, is we do all of this to take care of the soil and to take care of the resources we have so that we can have crops that we can sell and continue growing and continue caring for the earth and our resources. So anybody have anything they're doing before I call?
For the cover crop seeds, there are local places, and I haven't been buying them lately. I used to go to Ross Seed and Feed in El Reno. Love El Reno because that's my hometown. Stopped going there because I would call in advance and say, do you have this in stock? And they'd pull it up on their computer and say yes. Then I'd drive over there and they didn't have it. But I like Ross Seed and Feed. Right now, I'm probably doing most of my cover crops ordering online from a company called Green Cover Seed out of Nebraska. They actually have some very nice resources as you go through and you look at a particular crop, say barley. There, you click into that and it gives you the advantages, disadvantages, temperature for germination, what it does to your soil, and it'll tell you if it's a phosphorus fixer or a nitrogen fixer. So they actually have good resources. The downside is you're paying for shipping. The good side is once you calculate how much seed you have, unlike a local feed store, you don't have to buy a 50-pound bag of buckwheat. You can order 7 pounds or 12 pounds or 3 pounds. They will custom make your bag. They also will do custom mixes. You can go in and go, I want this, 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 and this at 20%, 20%, 20%, whatever it is. They'll blend it, make your blend for you, and ship it. The more you buy from them at one time, the shipping becomes cheaper. If you buy one 50-pound bag, the shipping is probably $50. If you buy 2 50-pound bags, the shipping is $75. You buy 3 bags, it's $95. It gets better, so I end up kind of going, what am I going to do for the entire year? And I buy all of my stuff and get it better. Mike?
So he's saying that the seed rep for green seed cover in Oklahoma can do a bundle order for multiple growers.
That's a good idea.
That's a beautiful idea.
I do know, I saw in their announcement yesterday on a newsletter, they do have a facility in Mountain View, Oklahoma, that they're doing the mixes. They're not doing a standard crop yet, but if you're doing a mix that they have there, the shipping out of Mountain View will be cheaper. I think they're wanting to expand that facility. So they're very knowledgeable. They also, I know they do some farms where they do truckloads of seed. Anytime I've ordered 7 pounds, they've made me feel like I'm their only customer. They're really good customer service. Next question.
I want to say too, in terms of what I mentioned at the beginning with context with sustainability, I know for myself being, 4th year now, just starting, I'm still very beginner. I think there comes a guilt in hearing what Kevin's doing, and I actually really appreciate like the whole 3-week aspect of if I have a bed that's open for 3 weeks, I can throw some buckwheat in there. I had not considered that, and that's definitely something I'm going to be implementing for several beds for lots of reasons. But I think for all of the growers at different scales, especially the newer growers, there's a tendency to feel guilty that you're not doing something, or I'm using a lot more plastic than I want to use in terms of reusable landscape fabric even. But and Kevin and I, in talking about planning this, you have to walk before you run. And there's a whole gamut of stages of sustainability. And so don't let yourself get discouraged. Start where you can start and just continually be working towards improvement. Just like Kevin is, just like I am, always just be looking for what you can do different, but don't let yourself feel guilty that what you're doing now isn't the most sustainable thing you can possibly do, because again, the goal is to stay in business and to improve that. So, did you have a question?
Yes, Carrie, you mentioned growing based on your customer demands. Do you have a system of collecting this information?
Yes, so I have an amazing husband who runs my social media. Actually, not most of the social media. I do the pictures and posts, but he runs our website. We have a buyer's club, which is our version of a CSA. It's kind of a customer choice CSA where they pick out what they want online from an account that they create with us at the beginning of the season. He sends out surveys. I heard somebody else mention this. I love social media. I love the followers we have there. They're very interactive with us, but I'm a big proponent, and at Market we have a newsletter sign up, and we use those email addresses, and we don't spam people, but we do make contact with those. And just in the weeks that we've been collecting those email addresses and sending out surveys, we've gotten a lot of really good feedback. It's pretty obvious too, like when stuff doesn't sell and people say, "Where's your old lettuce? We like it better." That makes it easy to decide too. So, anything else? Anybody have any other cover crop wow stories? Well, thank you. And I know Kevin is always available. I'm always available.
Somebody
Yes,
was
Amy.
pointing that had a question. Okay, the question, I'll repeat it for the people at home. She's asking how I decided my strategy. Did I take a soil sample first and then decide if I wanted to focus on organics? And I wish I could give myself that much credit. Early on, I didn't take any soil samples. It took me a couple years to get enough confidence on that. But it was focused on the fact that fertility was my second priority. We use a lot of good quality organic amendments or fertilizers that I know I can manage the fertility that way. And from a soil health perspective, I knew I needed one of two components: compost or cover crops. And both of those are adding organic matter. The more organic matter you can add, the fertility kind of takes care of itself. It balances your pH. It balances your stuff. Not 100%, but if you can add the organic matter, then the fertility falls in line. As you then start looking at your soil samples, you get your pH in balance first. Until you get it balanced, don't worry about doing this or that, because you're throwing your money away because it doesn't look at particular things. And the organic matter was most important to us, just to balance our soil. And now I'm really focusing on the fertility and the lab testing type stuff. So the fertility actually was the second priority for me, which sounds strange. But knowing the organic matter is going to solve 80% of the problems up front, that was my focus.
Well, and I think the drainage and our sandy and clay soil too, just adding that organic matter makes a huge, like you mentioned.
Yeah, we have drainage issues, and adding organic matter is helping a lot and breaking up compaction. Do I still tarp, or do I use cover crops to do weed control? Off season? I use tarps all the time, non-stop, winter, summer, spring, fall. Absolutely, because I can't get in and do a cover crop for 8 weeks to do a good weed suppression in the middle of the season, because I don't think I can take my beds out for 8 weeks. I can take them out sometimes for 2 to 3 weeks for a quick quick cover crop, maybe 4 weeks, but no. So we use a lot of tarping. Ideally, I like to do a cover crop, make the beds, add any fertility, broad fork it, and then tarp it in the summer for 4 weeks, and that adds to multiple things, the weed suppression, but also helps all of that organic matter break down. So in combination, yeah, the tarpings are significantly used in the process. Any more questions? Are we running out of time? Are we all about to take a nap after a nice lunch? I know I did. Right.
You might touch on that, just warn people that you don't want to put a cover crop like that down and direct plant some, shallow rooted crop, because it's probably.
Yeah, the comment Mike has is an excellent comment. I didn't go into great details on the Sudan. I mentioned that it's got chemical components in it that actually work as a not only weed suppressor, but seed germination suppressor, like cornmeal gluten or something. So if you do something like, every crop's going to be a little bit different. A lot of them have this component, and rye is one of them. You can't direct seed into rye for about 3 to 4 weeks after you cut it, because your seeds are not going to germinate, because the component doesn't recognize the seed as a weed or a crop. It recognizes it as a seed. So some of these weed suppressing components prevent germination. So you need to know what you're putting in, how quickly you're going to plant into it after you put in your crop. Are you going to be seeding, or are you going to be transplanting? So those are things that you need to kind of research on what you're doing. When I'm doing that full year cycle, I don't worry about it quite as much because I have time before my crops come in. But yeah, you have to be careful on the timing of when you terminate your crop and when you're going to put your cash crop in, because you may have just created an environment where you can't grow anything. That's a great point, Mike. Oh, she moved her hand. She wasn't questioning. I thought it was a question. All right, well, we're going to wrap up. We want to thank each and every one of you for putting up with us today and allowing us to get up here and talk. We'll be around for a while. If you have any questions, come see either Carrie and I. We love to try to help. Thank you.